So, one thing that was asked a lot was how we can pick up items. In our case, we will pick up weapons. So instead of cycling through all the weapons we have on our weapon manager in our weapons list, we're going to create a different list that is going to hold every weapon that we actually have picked up. Now we will start with the first weapon we have, and we will create a few pickable items. We're all going to see two weapons in our case, and when I'm over a weapon you will see that a text appears. So if I press X, I will pick up the pistol that is on the ground. Now the maximum weapons I can have is controllable, of course. I have set it to 2 weapons, so that means if I pick up the weapon right now and I can switch to it, doesn't matter. And when I go into a third weapon, instead of picking it up, I will get the dialogue to say that I can switch between basically the two weapons I have, and then it's going to create a new prefab, which is the pickable prefab for the weapons. Okay, and I can just like that take a different weapon and do everything else we were already doing. Now let's see with the code. First of all, let's take care of the canvas. In the canvas I've also added text over here. Let's raise it, let's make it a little bit bigger. Okay, just the text. And in the crosshair manager, let's just wait till it opens. Now I've added this in the crosshair manager since we already have a singleton for this, and there wasn't really any point creating a new script with a new singleton to just have only this text. Now in your own game you probably should keep this with everything that has to do with the UI, because in a full game you probably need to do a lot more stuff with the UI. So the only thing that we need to add in the crosshair manager is a reference to the text, which will say or not if we are picking up an item or not. On our third person controller, I have made it as a different behavior, but you could just place it in the input handler. But since we already have a lot of stuff in the input handler, I didn't want to clutter all the things, so I just made it as a different script. Now we're going to focus on basically these 3 scripts: the items base and the weapon item, which takes from items base. Now to take an item, well, we're actually going to use the items base for basically ease of use if we want to have different items, because either we're picking up an item or not, it's the same with all types of items. But after we know that it's an item, that a game is an item, and we want to pick it up, then we have to do checks to see if what type of an item it is. Right now we're only going to focus on weapons. Health items, okay, they just raise your health, even if your game, a lot of games don't even have health items anymore, and etc. Just for examples, we're not going to see any of these two. Okay, it's pretty easy to do. Just add on the health and destroy the game object. Now the weapon. But before we see exactly what the weapon is, the item type is, let's see the behaviors we're going to share between all items. and that just is the onTriggerEnter and onTriggerExit that come from mono behavior, which basically says if a collider enters its own trigger collider that has the item pickup behavior, which is the component we have on our controller, this one, then it goes, sets, this script has a variable with basically this component, and it goes set up this script as its reference to that item. And on trigger exit, it just goes and makes it null. Now, let's see the weapon item. The weapon item is actually really bare bones. You can add more stuff to this, but we're not going to do that. It derives, instead of taking from mono behavior, it takes from the item's base. And the only thing we're going to use is public string weapon ID. The reason that it takes from items base is because I want to have both of these functions, since these are shared between all types of items. So if I'm looking for an item, I can search with the class of items base and then separate everything I want to do. It's like searching for a collider. I can search for a collider and it will return all types of colliders Unity can have, which is box collider, sphere collider, and all that. Or I can search directly for capsule collider, box collider. It's the same principle like that. And of course we have done inheritance before. Okay, this is not the first time, so let's move on. Now, let's see the item pickup behavior. As I said before, I've made it as a different script, and this particular script does not even reflect on the input handler. So keep that in mind. And another reason why I didn't want to have it reflect on the input handler is because you might not want to use it on some projects. So in case you do not want to have something like this in your game, you can simply do not add the component on your controller. Let's see the item pickup behavior. It's pretty basic, not a lot of different stuff, and I've also have some additions to the weapon manager, which we are going to see. Now, the items base, the item to pick up is what I talked before, which is what the items base come and initializes or assigns. The weapon manager, the text is the UI text that says what weapon we are going to pick up, and the candidate of a weapon we are going to pick up. And init item is if we have initialized an item or not. So on start, we take the references. Of course, for the UI text, we're going to call the crosshair manager in singleton, and we're going to assign the pick items text. The weapon manager, we're going to get it from our own game object, and we can simply deactivate the UI text since we are not over a weapon that we want to pick up. Check item type and actual pickup. Check item type is where we check what kind of an item it is. Okay, we take the item base, we know it's an item, we now want to see if it's a weapon item. To do that, we need to check if we actually have an item, so the item to pick up is not null, and if we haven't initialized an item, we enable the UI text, and we have a check that is checking we have a switch statement that checks the enum of the item type, and in turn calls the correct function for each type. Now, since we only have weapon items, it will only call the weapon item pickup, and all other cases will fall under the default, which has nothing, and then we initialize the item. On the else statement of that, so when we already have when the item to pick up is null, if we already have initialized an item, that means we want to reset everything. So we reset the init item, the boolean, and we close the UI text. We do that because we do not want this function and all the other functions we have for the items to run on every frame. We only want to run the first time we are over an item. Weapon item pickup. We find or get the component. Since we know it's it's a weapon item, we can assign the weapon item component, which only has the string with the weapon ID. And since we have the string with the weapon ID, we can actually create the target ID, which is the ID we can find our weapon with. So we check if the available weapons we have on our weapon manager, which is a new list, instead of previously we were using straight up the list of weapons. Now we will create a new list with which we'll call available weapons, and how many available weapons we can have, we control it by this integer, which is maximum weapons. Since we change the list when we are switching weapons or what weapon we can hold, then we need to make sure that we have when we are starting the game we have at least one weapon, otherwise we will be getting an error. Or later on we can see if we want to have your player be unarmed instead of holding any weapons. For right now we're only going to assign the first weapon on the list of all our weapons. So the previous list we have acts as a resource list. So when I want a weapon, I have a weapon ID, I go into this weapon list and I get, I could say I clone the list entry, but I do not actually clone it. I just use the same list entry and assign it into this list. Now, since we want to change the list, we are actually switching the weapons. We only have to go into the previous, basically the previous code we had, and instead of the weapons, assign the available weapons. Let's close this. The next thing we are also going to add is add this little function over here, which returns a weapon with an ID. So we come back into item pickup behavior, and we basically come over here. I have a weapon, I have an item weapon, and I have an ID. Now I'm going to call this function with an ID, which in turn comes into our weapons list, okay, where we have all our weapons, and checks for that ID. Let's see it more closely. We initialize with the return value, and we have our for loop that is going to look through all the weapons we have, and it's going to compare the current weapon, the current entry in the list with the weapon ID. And since if this if statement runs, there's no point to look through other entries into the list, so we can actually break the for loop, and it will return the return value. Okay. Return current weapon just returns the current weapon we assign from here, because I do not want to use this to make this public, because I also want to do checks if the current weapon is null or not, and if I make this public I wouldn't be able to do that. Let me remove this and this. Switch weapon with target weapon. We need to come over here. We already have previously we have the switch weapon, which we were passing a desired index, and inside the desired index I also added this that checks if the desired index is greater than the available weapons we have, -1 of course, and then it resets the desired index and the weapon index to be both 0. And then the rest are the same as what we were doing before, but instead of a new weapon we have the weapons list, we just change it to available weapons, and we pass the desired index instead of the weapon index, which is this one. Now we're going to copy this function. Basically it's the exact same function, all of it, just copy it and repaste it over here, and instead of getting an integer we're going to rename it to switch weapon with target weapon, and instead of getting an integer it's going to take an actual weapon reference base and a target weapon. That way we are not looking into any we are not looking into the list to get a reference, where we know the weapon we want to check, so we only want to check to switch it like that. So the difference between this function and this function is that this function does not have the part where we check if the index is viable or not, so you do not need that, you delete that. And on the new weapon we directly assigned the target weapon instead of taking it from inside the list. And there is a few changes, there is a few different cases where we use one list or the other, one function or the other. Okay, so that's pretty simple. And the last thing we also need to add is create into our weapon reference base, create a reference that we have the prefab for when we are switching weapon, or the weapons that when we have two weapons and switch one, we need a prefab to instantiate, so that is a pickable prefab, so we can pick it up again. Okay, and we need to add that into the weapon reference base. So in turn I also need to go into my weapon manager and go for every weapon I have, go and assign a prefab over here, which we'll see how we can actually create these prefabs. So moving on, item pickup behavior. We come over here, we have a weapon item to pick up and we want to initialize it. As I said, we take the component of weapon item, we assign the target ID, and then we need to check if our available weapons, how many weapons we already have, are lower than the maximum weapons we are allowed to have. Then we assign the text to press X to pick up plus the target ID. Else, if we have enough weapons and the new weapon we're going to have is more than the weapons we are allowed to have, then we need to say press X to switch. We need to return the current weapon from our weapon manager, and we pass the weapon ID and we say with the target ID, so it just says switch this weapon with that weapon. Okay, pretty simple. Let's see the actual pickup, which the actual pickup is over here. And if I press the X, key code X, and we have a weapon to pick up, so the weapon pickup is not null, we need to find the target weapon. So we call from the weapon manager return weapon with ID, and we pass the weapon ID from our weapon to pick up. And if the target weapon is not null, because there is a chance this is going to return a null if the weapon ID, if all the entries in the list have no weapon ID like the one we are searching for, okay, then we can say add the new weapon into the available weapons we have, and then check if all our weapons we have with the new weapon we've added are greater than the maximum weapons we are allowed to have, greater or equals +1. We need to find the previous weapon, which of course is the current weapon we are holding. We need to remove the previous weapon, which is the current weapon we have, from the available weapons list, since we are switching. And here's where we call the switch weapon with the target weapon. We call the function to basically switch our current weapon with the target weapon. And if the previous weapon, the pickup prefab, is assigned, so it's not null, this check is basically, I've added this check because I was bored to go into all my weapons over here and create prefabs. Okay, so if it finds a prefab to instantiate, then it's going to instantiate the weapon, the prefab for the pickable item, and it's just going to instantiate it a little bit further ahead of the character and a little bit up with any rotation it already has. We do not care about its rotation. Then if we're actually picking up an item, we say destroy the game object, the pickable item that was on the ground, and then make null the weapon to pick up, and the item to pick up is null. So it's like we're not over a weapon anymore. And that's basically it, what you have to do to have pickable items and switch through the weapon manager, switch through a different list of the switch of the weapon manager. And let me check if I have any more bookmarks. We talk what this is, and I have one more. And yeah, in the new switch weapon with target weapon function we created, we also need to remove the weapon index with to be assigned as the desired index, since there is no desired index in this function anymore. Okay, this is obsolete, we are not even using, and that's about it. Now let's see how we actually create the prefabs. The prefabs are pretty simple to do. You need two game objects. One will be the child of the other, of course. And the top game object will have a box collider, a sphere collider, every collider you want to use basically. But keep in mind that it's also going to be triggered, and it's also going to have a rigid body. And we're also going to assign weapon item, not the item's base. I can assign the item's base, but I do not want to assign the item's base. And since I want the weapon item to use, basically I need to assign the ID. In this case it's a 911 weapon. I'll assign the weapon ID as the 911, and I'm going to assign the weapon type to weapon. Okay, and underneath it we're going to assign a model and a collider that is because this has a rigid body and the box collider is a trigger. Okay, we need to have a box collider, otherwise the item is going to fall through the floor. And that's about it. Simple as that. Just make sure you have the same weapon ID over here as the weapon that comes into your weapons list. Otherwise, if I change it, let's change the weapon ID to something else. Okay, if I go and pick this up, it's going to find the weapon based on the ID we're passing. Now you only need to make this as prefabs. I have a different folder for the prefabs. Okay, I'm going to reverse that, and that's about it, and we're done. So I'll end the video here. And one more thing before I forget is that on the casings we were creating, I had forgotten to add the destroy over time. Okay, so we already had created the script, so just hit add component destroy over time and set the timer. So when you shoot, it's going to delete the casings, which of course I can't find it over here. There. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Also consider supporting me on Patreon or picking up a project from Gumroad, so we can in turn continue making all these cool projects. So I'll see you next time.